So here we go. Rhythm Reading Bootcamp, Season 2, Episode 1. Welcome back if you made it through Series 1. If you haven't looked at Series 1, then go and check out those videos now. That covers a ton of stuff about rhythmic fundamentals and the basics of reading rhythmic notation, so well worth a look if you feel like you might need to brush up on your fundamentals. Season 2 is going to cover a whole lot of stuff, the wonderful world of syncopation and 16th notes. The 16th note subdivision is the thing that we are going to conquer over the next 9 episodes. Now, if you haven't already got a copy of the ebooks, Rhythm Reading Bootcamp Volumes 1 and 2, you can pick up your copies by clicking the link in the video description and heading to the Freebase Transcriptions web store. If you are, determined to make the most of your practice time and your musical development, you want to improve your reading, but you just find the concept of giving me any money absolutely horrific, then that's fine. I understand that. You can watch all these videos for free and still learn everything about 16th note syncopation. So the reason for this series and these books is that when I was learning to sight read, which I had to do at very short notice, having already been playing the bass for 8 years or so, I worked through the Louis Bellson book, Modern Reading in 4/4 Time, which is like a classic drumming text. And that book is great and it really helped me to get my reading together. But the problem with it is you have to kind of work things out by yourself. And for a lot of my students who come to me because they want to learn to read, we find that we have to break down a lot of these rhythmic syllables that I call fragments and go through them in greater depth rather than just being able to bulldoze through an exercise of new stuff that you've never seen before. So the whole point of this is we're going to go through every possibility of 16th notes and 16th and 8th notes associated rest that can happen within 1 beat's worth of music. I'm going to take each pattern one step at a time, and I'm going to hold your hand through the whole process. So hopefully it'll be really straightforward and easy. And the goal of this is to get you playing the music that you want to play. Now, a lot of the time when I talk to my students about, the players that inspire them most, the music they're most passionate about, the same names crop up again and again. So people like James Jamerson, Paul Jackson, Marcus Miller, Rocco Prestia, Jaco Pastorius, Joe Dart, all those people, all masters of the 16th note subdivision. People want to play like them, but for whatever reason they're struggling to either recreate the classic bass lines that they've heard on recordings or to improvise their own bass lines that have the same sort of rhythmic interest and intensity. And the first port of call is making sure that we are completely comfortable reading 16th note rhythms. So before we get into 16th notes properly, here are a few points of view to help you get the most from these videos. First of all, because this is a series focused on rhythm, we're going to try and take pitch reading off the table as much as possible. So each exercise only uses 1 pitch. That pitch will either be A, which could be 5th fret of the E string, open A string, or it'll use a D, which could be open D string, 5th fret of the A string, or even 10th fret of the E string. Your bass might have more strings than mine. You might be able to play that note in other locations. Good for you. You go for it. This series uses the American system of notation, so based on fractions, whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, 8th notes, 16th notes, etc., rather than the European classical system of semibreves, crotchets, things like that I was brought up on, because I feel like the American system is much clearer for everyone. Makes much more sense to talk about fractions than sort of esoteric names that only a handful of countries in the world might use. When we're looking at the exercises, you might see that some of the subdivisions are in black while others are greyed out. Now, if the subdivision is black, that indicates where we have an attack in the bar, where we're using our right hand to sound a note. If it's grey, we're either letting a previous note ring or we've got a rest. So if it's black, you play it. If it's grey, you either let the note sustain or you have a rest. Now, some of the rhythmic fragments that we're going to cover in this series look quite complicated and can be quite daunting to work on when you're first starting out. So one bit of advice that I use with all of my students, and it works really well, I had to do this as well when I was learning to read, is if it's hard to do, then make it smaller. If you're struggling to read a whole line, then try a bar. If you're struggling to read a whole bar, then just reduce it down to 1 beat's worth of music and really get confident with that. Loop it around over and over until you feel like it's sort of in your bones, as it were. And then you can gradually build up to the point where you'll be reading a whole line, 2 lines, whole page without stopping. But make sure that any new bit of information that you're working on is really consolidated and that you're really, really confident and accurate with it before adding new things. Otherwise, it's very easy to get bogged down in it, overwhelmed, and then you just stop working on your reading and you go back to using tab. A related point to making things smaller is that all of us need to practice things more often and more slowly than we think we need to. So don't be afraid to just go over and over the same bit of music until it's really inside your playing. Sight reading is just pattern recognition, and it just happens that some of the patterns that we're going to be dealing with look quite unusual and might be a bit challenging in the first instance. But if you practice them slowly enough and often enough, they'll become part of your rhythmic vocabulary. If you've bought the Rhythm Reading Bootcamp book, and if you haven't, you can do so by hitting the link below. If you've bought the book, don't be afraid to print out those pages and start scribbling, annotating the exercises. That is really, really helpful. So for example, if you're looking at a bar of music that looks like this, that can appear, quite complex at first, but if you get that pen out and mark out where each of the beats falls, and then you can underneath write where the subdivisions land, suddenly it's much, much easier to deal with. Now, you won't have to do that forever, but just in the early stages of learning, that's a really helpful tool to get your eyes again used to that, pattern recognition thing that we're aiming for. So you can see very clearly where each beat falls, and then you can break it down to one beat at a time and gain command of that series of rhythms. Now, one step that's really important in the learning process that a lot of people skip out entirely is that sometimes, especially when you're working on something new or unfamiliar, it's a really good idea to start away from the bass. So when you're getting this stuff together, don't be afraid to just clap out the rhythm that you're working on or tap it out on your lap while keeping the pulse going with your foot. So if we bring up that previous example, I could tap my foot, 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. If I can't clap it accurately, there's very little chance I'm going to be able to play it with any sort of competence on the bass. So that's an important step to go through. An alternative way of doing that is to clap or tap the pulse while vocalizing the rhythm using any sort of syllable that you like. Now, people tend to avoid that because it makes them feel stupid, because it sounds ridiculous when you're doing it. If you're sitting there going ba da 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 da, you sound like you've gone mad. But it's a very, very accurate and important way of practicing, because it means that suddenly you're able to sustain any longer note values, which obviously you can't do with a clap. Now, metronome is a very important practice tool, but I'd actually advocate starting without one for the time being. Again, especially if you're working on something new and unfamiliar, you don't always need that added pressure of having to get things strictly in time with the metronome. So use your own internal sense of time and give yourself a little bit of flexibility while you're getting the fragment that you're working on together. Then once you're really, really confident and accurate with that fragment, turn on the metronome, but do it slowly. Have it at 50 to 60 BPM, that's plenty, just to get you used to putting it in that grid, as it were, and having that pressure of strict time. Now, when you're using the metronome, an important thing, I think, to make sure of is that your click is the same on all 4 beats, that you're not accenting beat 1. A lot of my students, when they practice this stuff, they have a click that sounds different on beat 1, and that's a real crutch when they're practicing, because they're not developing that very, very important skill, that internal compass of where beat 1 is. If you think about it, if you're playing in a live situation, it's very rare that any drummer is going to help you out in finding the 1. In fact, more likely than not, they're going to disguise where beat 1 is some of the time. So you need to be really, really sure about where you are in the bar at all times. And I think that starts from day 1 of practicing this stuff with an unaccented metronome. Last practice tip is to record yourself. Not all the time, not every day, because then it becomes a bit of a sport, but every now and then, maybe once a week, sit down and record yourself. It doesn't have to be an elaborate recording setup. You can just use the voice note function on your phone. But what that allows you to do is be truly objective about how accurate you are with the rhythms and how in time you are relative to the click. Because when we're playing, none of us, I don't think, can be truly objective about our own playing, because too much of our brain's bandwidth is taken up with the act of playing itself. So you need a second set of ears to really assess how accurate your playing is. And for me, it's a really uncomfortable and sort of slightly brutal thing to do, but I always learn a lot from it. And so just record yourself every now and then. It will show you a lot about your own playing, good and bad. So before we get into the new stuff, let's go over the old stuff from Series 1 and Book 1. Before you begin on any of this 16th note stuff, it's really important that you are confident and accurate with the following basic note values. So this is all the stuff we covered in Book 1 and Season 1. Whole notes, dotted half notes, dotted quarter notes, and eighth notes, and of course their associated rests. Now, if any of that stuff isn't completely comfortable for you, it's really important that you go back, rewatch those old videos, go over the first book exercises, and make sure that you can do it without any problems whatsoever, because if your fundamentals are not together, things are really going to get tough when we get into the more complex things. So the new things that we're going to be covering in Book 2 of Reading Reading Bootcamp and in Season 2 are the 16th note, the dotted 8th note, and the double dotted quarter note, along with their associated rest values. So the plan is to, in a very systematic and ordered way, look at all the possibilities of 16th notes, 8th notes, dotted 8th notes, and associated rests that might occur within one quarter note beat's worth of music. And if you add up all those possibilities, you get these 17 little rhythmic syllables, which I refer to as fragments. Again, we can think about these as syllables that we put together, just like when you're reading words, you put syllables together to make words and to form sentences. So in the next episode, we're going to learn all about the 16th note subdivision, what it is, how to count it, and get started with our 16th note fragments.